Thanks, Gary. It's a great pleasure to be here with Andrew and Louise and all of you. Thank you all for coming so early. I'm going to start with a quiz of all of you. And the prize for the quiz, I had an idea what the prize would be, but Gary said no helicopter jokes. So instead I'm going to offer you a week at the Grand Hyatt on ANZSOG if you can answer this question. Here are 5 titles of political memoirs, and I want someone in the audience to tell me who wrote these books. The Good Fight, Fights of My Life, Straight Left, Stand Your Ground, and Hold the Line. Can anyone tell me who wrote those five books? I thought so. The Good Fight is a memoir by Wayne Swan. Fights of My Life is a memoir by Greg Combet. Straight Left is a memoir by Tom Uren, former Labor Minister. Now, I cheated a little here. Stand Your Ground is actually a memoir by Kevin Sheedy, the former AFL coach. And Hold the Line is a memoir by Matthew Scarlett, the former Geelong fullback. But I wanted to make a point about political memoirs here. Basically, these 5 titles are all the same. They speak of a life that was basically war by other means, or boxing or battle by other means. And it leads me to the question that we're hoping to address today: what can we learn from political memoirs? And the question is, do our political memoirs tell us what life in politics is really like? Do we get an honest, frank, courageous account of political life in political memoirs? Or do we get prosecution of the battle that the politician conducted in another way? I suppose there are 2 kinds of memoir. Andrew, you wrote a memoir in mid-career. Others, more commonly, I think, write a memoir at the end of their career. Do they write the truth, or do they run through the record and justify and say, this is why I did the things I did and this is why they were right? It's a question that I think Andrew and Louise are well placed to discuss. And I think, Gough Whitlam, one of our most famous politicians, wrote an incredibly tedious memoir. Bill Clinton, his wife once said there was never a sentence in the world that he couldn't fool with. His memoir was described as vainglorious. I remember reading a review. Vainglorious. It's 980 pages, Bill Clinton's memoir. Vainglorious, self-centered, and revealing of nothing. And I could run through a whole lot of political memoirs where people have been disappointed by what was revealed. I'm going to start with you, Andrew. We'll come to your own book in a moment, but let me ask you more generally: do you read political memoirs? Do politicians in general read political memoirs, or is it true that they just go to as a politician once told me, they just go to the index, they look at the references to them. If the references are all are negative, they write a letter threatening to sue. If the references are positive, they write letters to the writer saying how much they enjoyed the book. Is that true? What's your own encounter with political memoirs?
Well, I've found myself reading many memoirs of my opponents or previous opponents. And I do find most of those from my side of politics in the self-justification. Well, the other ones are too. In fact, I'd say 90%. I think it's human nature. You want your achievements or efforts to be seen in the best possible light, and you want to justify things that you've done or failed to do. But I found, because I was for 7 or 8 years running the political strategy of the party in the 90s, the memoirs of our opponents were just such a rich repository of relationships, right? So in and around the self-justification, there were lots of stories, which often are quite interesting in themselves, but you learn about all sorts of relationships. So there'll be senior business people or heads of organisations who it helps if you know that 25 years ago they worked for 4 years with Gough Whitlam, you know, or these sort of things kept emerging, which would surprise you because if you didn't know the networks and all the rest of it. So also you do get an insight into what makes those individuals tick, especially if they're, you know, the present day individuals. And again, I suppose, given my sort of strategic roles that I've had, you're really trying to see why people do what they do and what their motivations are and what their prejudices might be and all the rest of it. Because in the end, that's, you know, you're weighing up all those factors. And again, the memoirs are a really good source of, you know, who's a good hater and who will overlook that, who's got a strong policy interest or who's just, you know, just in the fight.
Yes.
Which is sometimes there are quite distinct personalities in politics. You sort of need all of them, but it's important to know, you know, who you can go and talk to on the other side, for instance, about some important policy initiative. Because in the end, you're there to move things forward for the community, and not everyone's bad on the other side, and not everyone's good on your own side. But you've got to know the personalities. You've got to know which buttons to push and that. So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of things, but I've found them useful. But I get bored with the ones on my side. I know the relationships, and I've been around too long so that I know, you know, I've got my own view about what happened.
And you probably know when it's rubbish and when it's...
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Is there a... that's really interesting. In a way, it's part of the fight for you. I'm not saying you're always entering them in combat mode, but is there a book by one of your opponents that really sticks in your memory? Did you read the Keating memoir?
Yes,
that Don Watson wrote? You were in government by the time that was published, so... I was, but also I'd been the federal director in the '93 election, which is where I got my twitch from. But that was the... You've done that before. Yes, well, people keep mentioning fight back. But that was an election where we took a great big new tax called GST to the election and from opposition, and lost the unlosable, so to Paul Keating. So he was my sort of nemesis for a long... But then, you know, I was campaign director again in '96, and we had the biggest Liberal win in history against Paul Keating. So it was a real contest for several years. And so I read with avid interest because, again, Watson, I think it was a very cleverly written book because it's beautifully written because he's a very good writer, Don Watson. But I think he found ways of inserting every sentence that he ever wrote for Paul Keating, but as Paul Keating's comments, you see. But everyone knew that he'd written it, you know. So, but it was still it took me back inside lots of issues that I'd been observing from the other side of politics, and I was constantly surprised by positions people took and that I hadn't been aware of, and a lot of the dynamics that were taking place. So for me it was a fascinating read, but again because I'd been so close to a lot of those issues, and it helped fill a lot of gaps for me, you know, from that decade, frankly. I'll come to you in a minute, Louise, but let me just ask you one more question, Andrew, on that theme. A lot of the Labor memoirs are in part perhaps a celebration or a navel-gazing about the culture that is the Labor Party. The Labor Party likes telling stories about itself, more than the Liberal Party, I would suggest, but you tell me if you disagree. When you read those books about the Labor Party, are you filled with a kind of respect, or do you get irritated and think, oh God, those books really bang on a bit about the left, you know, the ALP side of politics? What's your response as a Liberal to that, you know, massive books? I mean, you know, Bob Carr said there are so many books about the ALP, it's like a new literary genre, like vampire novels. You know? To which Mark Latham said it's Labor's Twilight series. You know? So where do you, as a Liberal, stand on reading some of those books?
Well, the thing that can annoy me most is if it's badly written, right? And some of them are hopeless. I mean, it's not unique to one side of politics. But so that's the thing that'll annoy me most. My prejudice about my opponents is probably fairly well ingrained. So no, I mean, I've got respect for some and not for others, and it's the same on my own side. But I really am looking for vignettes through the books, right? So if it's really well written, like the Watson book, and then but also, you know, it's filling in big gaps for me. A lot of times the Labor books are filling in gaps for me, like I was mentioning. You know, who's connected to whom and all that. And in the Labor Party, it's huge. The network. Yeah. It is mafia-like, you know, in its in its structure, not necessarily in its outcome. But
and if you don't name a name now, you'll stay out of the courts.
Yes. But my favourite book of all, it's not so much a political memoir, but it's a book that was written about the 1988 US presidential campaign. It's What It Takes by Richard somebody whose surname I've forgotten for the moment. But What It Takes, I've got multiple copies. I used to give it to all my staff at the Federal Secretariat when I was running campaigns and all the rest. But it tracked the 4 Democrats, or the 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans who set out to run for president in the 1988.
Mike Dukakis was there.
Yeah.
And,
yes, it was. There was a whole lot of characters, but it was just, it tracked, it was a huge book, you know, about 1,000 pages, and it had done 4 years of research after the 1988. It only came out into 1992, but it went right back to their childhood and their grandparents, and you'd have 3 pages on Mike Dukakis, you know, in the campaign. Then the next 4 pages will be about Gary Hart when he was a kid, and it just chopped and changed. It kept your interest the whole way through, but it slowly built a picture of the 7 or 8 candidates, and then, you know, somewhere page 245 one would drop out. Yeah. But by that stage you had come to realise why that person dropped out. I mean, Gary Hart, who famously, you know, was a great moralistic sort of person in his preaching, but was, you know, caught out on a boat with one of his many women, I think. And but you saw, even from his experiences and the nature of his parents, and it was a wonderful character study of what takes people to, one, want to run for high office like that. And that's another thing about these memoirs, that they are all A-type characters, and you know what drives them. And so you do get, if you're interested in the psychology and what makes people tick, and you know, strengths and weaknesses and all of that, which fascinates me. These political memoirs are wonderful for that.
That's fascinating. Louise, when Gary introduced you, what he didn't say was that as the publisher at MUP, you've really done a fabulous job of developing a really large stable of books on Australian politics, and that's been great for our politics. We've had all sorts. You really have published a very wide range, including many memoirs and accounts by political people. What can we learn? Having done that and having published so many different works, what do you think we can learn from the political memoirs, the ones you've published? And overall, have you been pleased with the quality of the work and the reflection inside them, or have you been disappointed?
Well, I guess our job is to be part of, you know, a public debate, MEP's mandate, to contribute to public discourse. Politics and the political culture and the history of politics in Australia has been sort of the patch we've sort of carved out for ourselves in part. We do other things, but that's particularly what we're interested in, and particularly what I'm interested in. And I was very interested in Andrew's comment that he learns a lot. He's looking for, I think actually he's looking for intelligence from his opponent's memoirs, which gives me something to think
Now, when you
about.
say intelligence, you mean military intelligence
Military,
rather than
well,
real actual...
No, he's not looking for intelligence. That may be, that's a kind of, I won't go there. You know, you may or may not get that, but you certainly get political intelligence and political capital and information really on your opponents, which I find riveting to think, if I think of the books that we've published. So I guess we think our task is to offer politicians the opportunity to talk about their careers. Different, you know, it's sort of hard because it's such a kind of broad genre in a way, but the mid-career memoir or reflection of the sort that Andrew's written, and I hope he'll talk about this in a minute, was a different sort of project than the memoir. It was written for a particular purpose. But I'm always urging politicians to take us inside the practice of government, because that's what I'm, you know, of course you're only ever just an editor or a publisher working with an individual writer, really, when you begin and work through the project. Later it becomes something else. But I'm always hoping that we'll understand as an ordinary citizen, that I'll understand something about the process, how decisions were arrived at, what were the dynamics in the room, who was left out of the conversation, who was in the conversation. That's why I'm interested in that book you're referencing, Whatever It Takes. I've always dreamt that someone will write the book about the political campaign. I asked Andrew to do it, and of course he said, no, can't do that, because politicians are always incredibly careful. They do sanitise the facts, and they do write themselves into history. They do justify themselves, and I think that's pretty. You know, I don't think that's unexceptional or objectionable in a way. I think, why would one write a memoir if not to say, well, I aspired to do X, I did achieve Y, I'm disappointed that I didn't, I couldn't prosecute A and B. I think that's all pretty reasonable. For me as an editor, publisher, I'm interested in the process of sanitising what happens. I always remember Peter Costello, who worked with Peter Coleman, his father-in-law, and Peter Coleman and Costello worked over successive drafts of each chapter together. Coleman is a natural writer, a very polished writer, and Costello would have said, would freely admit himself he hadn't written anything of a book length before. So it was a very interesting collaboration between the two of them. But I understood that Costello's sort of project in the end would be to take his never mind his political antenna, but his lawyerly instincts, and be cautious about what he wrote. He's writing for posterity, he's writing for after, not for being in the maelstrom of political life. And so I want the irreverent, the rude, the revelatory, the kind of abrupt, the banging up against the rails, but I'm never going to really get that. I'm only going to occasionally get that when people have got nothing to lose, and very few people have got nothing to lose in politics or the afterlife of politics. So I understand the limits and accept the limits of the genre, apart from Mark Latham, who stands alone, who stands alone above or below or to the side, however you want to view it.
So did you find yourself in the unusual position of Mark Latham saying, oh no, you can't publish that?
Actually I said, maybe you don't want to say that, Mark. For the first time, usually you want to say, come on, Andrew, come on, tell us what happened in the party room, and they'll say, oh no, look, really, and that wouldn't be fair to my colleagues. Well, with Mark, it was actually the reverse. Perhaps you don't want to say that, Mark. So that was an entirely different project.
But the question is, when politicians are being cautious in the way that you describe, is it out of a lawyerly concern, as you said, for and a solidarity of protecting one's colleagues, or is it something in the makeup of the politician that makes it difficult for them to be introspective? By the way, my book is sticking up here because Louise is a good publisher. I didn't put it up like this, she did.
I did.
And now I'm going to put it down.
No, and I'm really cross that we haven't got Andrew's here because it should be on the other side.
And the reason why I brought it along was because I just had a paragraph where I reflected on this in the book, and because I thought a lot about memoir, and this is what I wrote about this. Why are memoirs boring? In part, it's because politicians are a breed apart, 9 parts human, 1 part rhinoceros. Politics is a life bet. You spend years trying to tell one story, why people should vote for you, validate you, love you. Years on message, in attack, in the papers, away from family, in the supermarket, smiling at strangers, having to compose a face every time you walk in the street, but you get no sympathy because you hungered for this job. And in the end, if you become Prime Minister, you usually have to be dynamited out of it. After all that, after a lifetime telling one story, having staked everything on it and changed the country, or not, how do you turn around and tell another story? I made mistakes. I had doubt. I sometimes wondered whether it was all worthwhile. Far safer to tell a few funny stories and run through the record. And I just wonder, Andrew, I mean, you've written what is actually a revealing memoir of politics and mid-career as well. But I wonder if, before we come to your book, could you reflect on that, whether politicians are not by nature the sort of people who, you describe them as A-type characters, more males than females to date in our politics. Do you think there is a propensity not to be able to look inward and reflect just because of the nature of being a politician?
I think that's a fair assessment. You spend, if you're a cricketer and you spend 20 years practicing a certain stroke, it's very hard to get it out of your system. So if you've spent 30 years in politics doing the sort of things which you very eloquently, I thought, suggested, characterised the life of a politician, it's very hard to then be introspective. And sure, everyone would have moments of doubt and all the rest of it, but most of the time you're just saying to yourself, get on the front foot, and you're that sort of person anyway. Yeah. That's most of the people there are. And the self-belief amongst politicians is necessary and is huge. Okay, I've found it in other professions too, of course, the CEOs and all the rest. Yeah. But it's certainly a characteristic of all politicians, whether they're at the top or the bottom. But so it does make it very difficult from a memoir point of view, I think, and can make unless they're a raconteur, around a dinner table, it can be very boring too, unless they've got great stories. Yeah. Right. And increasingly, we're losing the characters out of politics. Increasingly, the boring conversations, and people are so practiced now at not revealing. They're so disciplined. It's a bit like professional football. You're losing the characters out of foot because they're all so disciplined. Yeah. And it's a feature of modern life in lots of ways. So
why is that? You've raised a really important. Louise and I were just talking about this. Why have we lost the characters out of politics, out of business, out of sport? What's going on?
Well, it is this increasing professionalism, right? So, certainly, in sport, I think it's obvious that as they've brought in more science into it, same with politics, you bring more science into it. I spent a decade trying to improve the polling techniques and things, and then using that to impose discipline on colleagues so that they didn't run off at the mouth and show what was really on their mind. Heaven forbid, let's not portray what's really people are really thinking.
And yet we're all hungering for that, of course.
Well, also it is such a fast-moving. They say that on average we're all absorbing up to 4,000 communications a day, right? And from everything the ads we pass and driving along, everything. Now, to try and compete in that space, you can't have 100 different messages going out all the time. It's got to be highly disciplined, or otherwise no one will ever hear it. And there's those sorts of things which has really driven politics. Plus, in Australia particularly, we've got party politics, which does impose in itself high discipline. Labor Party, if you break it, you get tossed out. You get sent to Coventry in our party, but still similar effect. But there's huge discipline, which is also, you put that together with the professionalism and the welter of communications and the much greater training now of all the different parts of politics, and all these things have combined to produce a type, cookie cutter politician, and it's unfortunate. I think. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Louise, do you have thoughts on this question?
I'm just listening to Andrew and thinking, I wish I heard more of this Andrew Robb, in the media, and of course you can't. It's your Exhibit A. I don't know whether the audience feel like I do, which is he is a sophisticated, subtle analyst, nuanced, able to kind of understand and make sense and analyse what's going on, and That's what we get in the privilege of this private, sort of session. And of course, you cannot prosecute that in the public sphere because it's counter to what's asked of you. But whether you need, it's like we were just talking at the table before about Andrew calling Alan Jones a racist on his radio program, which was a moment, a little eruption, irregular blip on the way in which people normally deal with appearing on Alan Jones' program, and what the political cost will be of you speaking, truth to power, if we can use the cliche. It's a rare moment, a rude moment, and I mean rude in quotation marks, but an abrupt moment in another way. You've got to keep it bland, don't you? You've got to keep it vanilla, beige, and when you don't, any one of you as politicians.
Yes.
But can I just jump in and say, when Andrew calls Alan Jones a racist, I would imagine that many people out there would say, good on him, he's speaking what he believes.
Correct.
He used blunt language, he told the truth, I mean, why, Andrew, why can't, politicians... The paradox of this debate is that people out there are craving for authenticity and honesty and blood, red blood from their politicians. The politicians must know that, and yet they can't do it. What's going on?
Well, the thing is that, the expressions of individual character can often become a story in themselves, and then the argument or the policy or whatever it is you're trying to prosecute as a team at that time, it gets moved off the front pages, and the eccentricity or the character manifestation that becomes the issue, and all your colleagues say you're not playing the team game. You're taking a big flash mark. But we were on a roll at the time. We had the ball going down the paddock very fast, and you've taken the big flash specky, and
and gone back.
taken 15 minutes to get back and and have a kick. So they feel it's indulgent, right? So you get these endless pressures, and nowadays there'll be a whole team of people in the leader's office, and you'll get a phone call, and after a while it sort of just slowly but surely gets everyone into line. That's both sides of politics. And
but then I'm sorry, James.
No,
but then the conversation, the kind of way in which we as citizens you understand the cynicism that then
No, I do.
it plays itself out among ordinary citizens. We feel like this is parliamentary politics is a sort of sport, sanitised sport, and boring, has nothing to do with us.
Inauthentic.
We're not persuaded. That art of going out and arguing for reform, whatever political hues. You've been around for a long time. All that gets lost in a sense, and what an impoverishment it seems to me to be of our political culture. Us as citizens engaged with politicians and political life and the policies that are going to affect us. That's all sort of gutted. It's not just for the theatre. It's not that it's interesting when Andrew Robb goes on and calls Alan Jones a racist. That's interesting. Those of us who are not Liberal supporters, I'm sorry, Andrew, but those of us cheer you on briefly for a moment. You're our man today, this morning. Anyway.
You just want me to provide theatre.
No, I want you to come out and say Alan Jones is a racist, and I'm very proud of you, author. But that's sort of, we're so cynical. You know the numbers better than I do, and the sort of disenchantment, the kind of way in which we feel so cut off from what's happening. And you've got a reform agenda. Prosecuting the trade deal.
But who wins? You see, I mean, you go back in the last 20 years, and invariably the disciplined, united, boring, all of the things that. We're a little bit concerned about. They're the parties that are winning, and in the end, you're driven in this life by incentives and disincentives. Now, winning government is the huge incentive in politics, and when each time you look at who's just won in a state election or a federal, invariably they have been far more disciplined, far more on message, far less indulgent, and as a consequence, you get worn down. And
I think Andrew's actually provided a fascinating insight, and your football analogy is actually much more relevant than people might think. I mean, I know a little bit about the Geelong Football Club. They were famously a team of individualists. They had Gary Ablett Sr., the most famous loner and individualist of all time, and he was adored at Geelong. And then but they never had any success. And then when they turned themselves into a team and became played beautiful football, but in a sense, all the individuals disappeared inside that unit, and everybody just started talking about playing their role and doing their bit for the boys and all that stuff. They suddenly achieved success. And I think the football analogy is not a lazy one. It's actually very. I'd never thought about it in the context of politics, as you've just put it, but it's probably right. That is the incentive there is to lock in a group. Success is more likely that way.
It is.
Yeah.
But that's to suggest the game is a game paid by professionals in a particular, professional, activity. That's in it of itself perfectly sensible. But the problem for us is it's not football. It's about our civil society and reform, change, national agendas.
Yeah, I lament it as well.
Yeah.
There's a loss.
I went off into business for 8 years, in between being in the party machine and then the parliament. And I mainly gave advice on strategy to all sorts of companies. And I found that the principles of effective political strategy, some of which we've just been talking about, were identical. And it wasn't just corporates, there might be major not-for-profit organisations, but they had a problem or they had an opportunity, and I'd go in and make an assessment and suggest these are things you've got to do to succeed. And I'd just be I'd have the same simple little template in my head, and I'd just be putting it across all these. So it's not just football, okay? It is how we improve an organisation and have more jobs and all the rest of it. It is a set of principles, I think, to play out in most theatres in which we work.
Gary, will you keep us a sense of the time? Because I want the audience to have a chance to ask Louise. Yeah. Well, let's just very quickly though. Andrew has written a memoir, and it's called Dog Days, Public Life, Private Demons.
Black Dog Days.
Black Dog Days. I beg your pardon. Published by Louise and MUP, and just very quickly, Andrew. In writing that book, it's both a mixture of your political life, mid-career, as I said, and a very personal account of your battle with depression. Was the hesitation very strong for you before you wrote that book? Did you worry a lot about divulging information about your illness at that time?
Well, I certainly did. Well, I didn't confront it for 43 years, so I had you could say that I was reluctant to take it on. But yeah, once I decided that I had this illness that I had never admitted to, and had done all sorts of bizarre things to try and deal with it, I felt always that if I went public, that was the end of my political career because of the stigma, which had been the problem for me all along and is for most people, how feel that they will be judged and the opportunities that they'll be denied. I thought, and I still think that if most of the jobs I've had through life, if I'd had psychiatrists on the bottom of my CV as having seen a psychiatrist, I never would have got any of the jobs, frankly. Yet I'm good in a crisis. They think people, if you've got a mental illness, you're under the table when things go wrong. I was the reverse. The adrenaline would pump and I'd be good. I'd be normal. But so it was a big issue for me. But in the end, it just got to a point where it was so debilitating, and yet I had all these responsibilities. And so I decided, this is more important to deal with it. The book side of it, that was 2 months. The decision on that was 2 months after I'd gone public and I'd taken leave from shadow cabinet, not the parliament, but to try and experiment with solutions and all the rest. But I got a call from somebody who's sitting next to me, and I do.
It's hard to say no to.
Yeah, she is. Well, it wasn't just that. She didn't know it, but I had said no to her. Firstly, I'd never thought of writing a book. I didn't think I had it in me to write a book. Secondly, all of these reading all these boring books by politicians, that reinforced my view not to write a book. Thirdly, from a campaign point of view, I'd never finished a campaign book because it's so boring. You want to go to sleep at night, pick up a campaign book, and people who've written about how to run campaigns and campaign experiences. So for a whole lot of reasons, but I didn't think I had it in me. And then Louise rings and says, Andrew, this is, I'm in the depths at this stage. And of course, this big cheery voice comes over the line. Andrew, this is a wonderful story and da-da-da-da-da, you should write a book. And I'm saying, yes, Louise, I'll think about it. Which, yes, I will think about it. And I got off the line and I thought, that's the end of that one. Anyway, 5 days later, I go to the psychiatrist for sort of monthly meeting or whatever. And at the end of it, he said to me, oh, Andrew, by the way, last weekend, all the psychiatrists in Victoria got together for the week. We do it every year, once a year, just to compare notes. And he said on the Saturday morning, someone jumped up and said, I don't know what's going on, but the last 2 months, I've had this welter of particularly executives over 40 coming in to declare they've got a problem. And someone else stood up and said, I've had the same. In the end, they all concluded it was because I had gone public. But the thing is, that what really struck me was, I had gone public, and Laurie Oakes wrote a column, and I did an interview with Neil Mitchell, and then I said no more. I just wanted it out there so people know I wasn't under the table, but I did have a problem. And I thought, I can't believe there wasn't a lot of coverage. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't page one story or anything. It was just, Robb's got a problem. And I thought it had such an impact that I went home and thought about it for a while. So, and then a few days later, I rang Louise and said, if I nail this problem, if I get back into politics, and I'll write the book. Yeah, so 6 months, took me 6 months to find a solution, and I've now had 4 years that I didn't have for 43 years every day.
That's great.
So, but that's why I wrote the book. And the other thing is that all these boring books. Pam Williams had written a book, The Victory, after the '96 election. Now I enjoyed it because we won, but more than that, I mean, everyone who said to me about Pam's book, a lot of them read it in one read, right? And I've followed all of her stuff, and she's a good friend, and she writes in an anecdotal style, whereas most journalists write in an opinionated style, right? But she writes and the facts come out through stories and personalities, how people react, not statistics. And so I determined, I want people to enjoy the read. That's why I put in other aspects of my life, because I thought a book totally on depression is not going to be all that enjoyable. But also, I ended up, different stages of life, I just think of different anecdotes. And I wrote a whole long list and then went in and sat with Sally at MUP, and I just talked about each story, and then we put it into a book.
That's terrific. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, and I think we should all honour your courage in writing the book. And I'm sure it's had a huge impact for a lot of people who do suffer from depression. Let's have some questions from the floor. Does anybody want to ask Andrew or Louise anything about our question? What can we learn from political memoirs? Anne.
Hi Louise, hi Andrew, thanks very much for that, it's terrific. Louise, this is a question for you. Who's the politicians you've never been able to get to agree? Andrew says you're very hard to say no to. Who's the one you want?
Paul Keating. It's really easy. And it's very interesting that Keating hasn't yet. James might kind of comment on this. There wouldn't be a publisher in Australia that hasn't, seduced, courted, pursued, whatever. We thought at one point, what if we sent him a Xenia suit or a kind of, but of course MEPs are not-for-profit and part of the Melbourne University, so of course we couldn't possibly do such a thing. But you wonder with Keating whether, his argument is that he made modern Australia. And some might say that's correct or not, one might debate that. But whether for him the enormity of the project of sitting down to write that history, that contribution, is so large that it actually is not possible to do. I don't know. I'm psycho. I'm sort of, theorising about the impediment for why he hasn't done it. He's published a book on Asia, a small book on an essay on engagement with Asia years ago. He's done his speeches, which have been fantastically successful. And he talks and he sort of, teases, publishers. Kerry O'Brien, the interview. And he said that he did the Kerry O'Brien interviews because MEP published Blanche's latest book on the Hawke years and the Hawke office, and that was the last thing he had to say on the subject. Don't know whether that will be the case or not. And Kerry is now writing up those transcripts into a book. And he said he would do that in lieu of doing a memoir. But it's very interesting that he's the one everyone wants to get, because he's, A, I think he's a fascinating character, B, you can see that he can actually write really beautifully. I read his opinion pieces and think he writes really well, and it's a kind of lively, idiosyncratic, eccentric, passionate political animal, and that's what makes him a riveting character in a more beige than one might like political environment now. But everybody wants the Keating, and I wonder whether he'll ever do it, which is sort of, poignant in a way if he doesn't.
Yeah, it's interesting. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, gentleman over here. If you just wait for the mic to come around.
Thank you for your presentations. One of my colleagues at my university is a former official who decided, he's a former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada. So he's writing his memoirs, but in order to do so, he went off to a Harvard memoir writing camp. Or it's a course. So I'm wondering if you've heard of that or similar kinds of ways to encourage people to write memoirs, and do they work, or do people have to simply have it in them or be guided well?
And camp for memoirists. Can you imagine what that would look like? I'm just thinking of who we're publishing this year. Bowen. I can never remember because we're already on 2016, but Bowen, Jenny Macklin's writing, Wreath Papers, Amanda Vanstone is talking but not committing yet. If I think of camp, it would be hilarious. In fact, I think it's a documentary, isn't it? Or it's a mini-series. Curb Your Enthusiasm Part 2, or whatever. I don't know, but it just sounds fabulous. I don't think you'd get Australian politicians to go to camp together. I'd be very happy to be camp mum, but I don't think we would. Very interesting. We really like the dialogue with the politician about the structure and the shape. But they want to write what they want to write, and we have a kind of particular view at MEP. Others have different. We're not. The editor is not the God. God is not an editor. The editor is not a god. It's your book. It's your story. We can only help you. We can say, look, chapter 2 seems to be in the wrong place. It should be at chapter 13. We're not clear about this anecdote, and the structure doesn't hold together. But in the end, it's the author's book, and it's their name on it, and we feel that we need to be respectful of that. So there's a limit to how much. Some people are very open. Andrew was very open to editorial advice and guidance. Others are very clear. I want to write in this way, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is the book. Take it or leave it. And it's a very interesting process. Oh, Christopher Pine would have to come to camp. We've just published. I'm sorry, it's just there nothing. Oh,
do they
sell?
We're
just going to leave
do
that
they
there.
sell?
Do they sell?
Yeah. Do political memoirs sell?
Some do. I published Bob Hawke's memoirs in the 1990s. It was the best-selling memoir. It sold 75,000 hardbacks in the 1990s, only bettered by John Howard's,
which has sold hundreds.
Over 100. No, not hundreds. Over 100,000. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
About 110,000.
But if you had published it, you wouldn't be correcting me now.
Correct. It would be hundreds of thousands. It would be hundreds of thousands. We all lie all the time about numbers. No, you can't lie anymore because we can see what happens at cash registers. Nobody can lie anymore. But John Howard has sold fantastically well. And it's so interesting because the book was critically panned. It wasn't reviewed positively. It had no impact whatsoever, the reviews that publishers hang on to and think are very important. He sold extremely well. Even his book on Menzies, the next book he wrote, has sold very, very well. So his is the best-selling. Battle Lines, I mean, I thought it's very interesting, those mid-career books that politicians do. Battle Lines did Tony Abbott the world of good. He always says that, and that it actually was really important. It was a provisional sort of manifesto, a declaration of a bunch of ideas at a particular moment in his career. It sold well, probably about 20,000 by now, which is modest compared to Howard's, but it keeps on being referred to. That's, in a way, that's why I think politicians are careful, because that once it's out, once it's published, it's there forever. Although books have no longevity anymore, yet they do. It's a kind of curious
journalist
paradox.
can go and find it.
And the journalist will always go and find it.
Some more questions? Anyone else want to ask something? Yes, in the front here. Just wait for the mic.
Louise, I was just curious, what's your favourite political memoirs?
My favourite book.
And your least favourite?
No, I can't never. All my authors are my favourite authors. No. I don't have a favourite. I don't have a favourite. I've found all of them interesting. You have hope, you want people to write. Well, Latham's was riveting.
It was.
It was riveting. It was unexpurgated. It was, some would call it a revenge manual. It took us inside the political culture of a party. It was such an interesting case study for those of us who are observers of the political press. It's not my favourite because it's not an easy read. It's not a pleasant read. But it's a rich primary source document, if you like. I thought Andrew's was very important. It made a huge difference. Costello's was important to signify 11 years as Treasurer. I think of many of them. I liked Greg Combay's because I thought it was testimony to a life in politics, in political life, a life of political activism. So I guess I have more. Maybe I respect politicians who are genuine in their politics, and I think most of them probably are.
What about Julia Gillard's? Have you read Julia Gillard's, Andrew?
No. I mean, I read, I've got it.
The extracts, you've read
I've read it. No, I didn't look up my name.
I think she was more worried about her own side than
Yeah.
about your side.
No, I just haven't got to it, really. I mean, it's not because just the job I've got at the moment.
Of course.
I just, I just don't have I was 182 nights overseas last year. I'm going to be that again this year, so I just haven't had the time. But I'm looking forward to it because, again, you're a witness to a lot of it, and you do. It's remarkable, some of the things you just were unaware of. Gary Gray was he was the Labor secretary when I was running the party in '96, and that book of that book of Pam Williams, The Victory, it had it wrote it through the eyes of the two campaign directors, which all the time it was being written, I had no idea that was going to be the case, and I suffered a bit later because the hero was John Howard, but the book was through the eyes of the two campaign directors, which, but anyway, I couldn't believe some of the things that had happened, instances which I lived to the nth degree during the campaign, and to see what Gary was going through, because he, Keating was, had moved on from politics, I think, at that stage almost, and he was extraordinarily indulgent in that campaign, and I felt very sorry for Gary after, well, sort of, after I read the book.
Bit,
a little bit.
I should say, the one coming back to me, I thought the Cabinet Diaries, Gareth Evans' Cabinet Diaries, was fantastic because of his. Well, first of all, it reminded me so much of a period in which you had such rich, interesting, complex characters around the cabinet table, and that the debates were important. I'm sure they were petty and silly, and whatever, whatever. But they were also struggling to imagine a modern Australia. So you saw great characters around the table. His sense of irony about himself, self-deprecation. it felt to me like I was reading something really rich and interesting.
And it's a diary, right?
And it's a diary.
He's writing it as he feels the
Correct.
emotions,
And
and
he-
now with passage of time, he's put it out.
Correct.
So you get
So he was really, he dictated at night, he went back to it was a very short period, a couple of years, and he was exhausted and couldn't keep it up. But it's such an interesting insight, but it's because the political period was also interesting. And his sort of self-iron, his own ambition, he lays it all bare. So that was really pleasurable to read and to, publish.
Gary, question from you. All right.
Tracy will be looking at me and with one eye on the watch, and so we'll have to wind up. But if you'll allow me the indulgence of one question before I wind up. You said you felt a bit sorry for Gary Gray, sort of, and it almost implied that the two campaign directors had a friendship that may have transcended politics. One of the things I think we observe, or don't observe so much these days, is those friendships across the political divide. Is that another change that's occurred in the professionalism and the sort of trends that you were talking about, Andrew, that we don't get those friendships across the political divide, where you get the theatre in the House, but afterwards you go and have a beer in the members' bar?
Well, the absence of a members' bar is an unfortunate thing, and plus everyone is so busy, and the new Parliament House, which is fairly getting old now, but it does so separate the ministry from even its own backbench, and then the media somewhere else in the building altogether, and it's not a good building for fostering those sort of relationships, which is really unfortunate. But there are still plenty of relationships. Gary Gray is one of my good friends, okay, and you don't tend to go and have drinks and dinners so much with the opponents, but the thing is the committee structure. So as a backbencher, if you've had several years before you get other opportunities maybe, there's a lot of committees which go around Australia doing hearings and this. So you are spending time and at nights, and there's things happen. You go overseas, usually in a bipartisan way. There's not lots, but there's enough where you're spending a solid week with other members of the other side, and some of them you obviously you get along with, and you develop friendship. So there's you see the question time, the vitriol and all the rest, but often that is not personal so much of the time. Sometimes it gets a bit personal, obviously, but most of the time it's not, and you'll end up walking beside coincidentally someone from the other side down the corridor to go back to your office, and you're talking away as though nothing had happened. And people don't see that side of it. There is quite a mutual respect, and there's quite a lot of friendships across the chamber, but they were stronger in the past, I think, because there was a bar, and in the old Parliament House, and both sides would be there, and it was just there was a greater esprit de corps, I think, in the past.
Still, if you're in Canberra and you go to the old Parliament House, go into the old members' bar, you can still feel the atmosphere in that place. It's there. So, well, I'm reassured. I think we all are by that comment, Andrew, and we all want to thank you for your candour this morning. I think that's been wonderful, and Louise, all those insights from a publisher, and Jamie, fantastic to bring all of that out. So, could I get you all, please, to thank the three speakers? Thank you.